My sister took credit for everything I did for the family. So, I finally spoke up and made sure everyone knew the truth. It's a funny thing about life in the grand old heart of Europe, the more history you carry in your bones, the less the modern world seems to see you. We live in an age of glass and steel, of flashing screens and personal brands, where the value of a human soul is often measured by the sharpness of a suit or the brand of a watch. But they forget, don't they? They forget that the tallest oaks grow from the quietest earth. I'm sorry, sir, but this table is reserved for, well, for people who actually belong here. That was the sentence that started it all. Not a shout, not a blow, just a cold, clinical dismissal delivered by a young man in a vest that cost more than my first car, looking at me as if I were a smudge of dirt on a pristine marble floor. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. To understand how a man can be pushed to the brink of his own erasure, you have to understand the family I built, or rather, the family that thought they had outgrown the very foundation they stood upon. My name is Arthur, and at 75, I have learned that silence is often mistaken for weakness by those who talk too much. I sat in the corner of my small cottage, the same one I'd shared with my beloved Martha for 45 years, watching the rain dance against the window pane. Outside, the European countryside was draped in that familiar, melancholy gray, the kind of weather that makes you want to wrap your hands around a warm mug and remember better days. But inside, the atmosphere was even colder. My son, Julian, and my daughter, Claire, were pacing the floorboards like vultures circling a dying beast. They weren't there to check on my health or to ask if I needed anything from the market. No, they were there for the family council, a self-appointed tribunal designed to decide what to do with the problem of their father. To them, I wasn't the man who had worked 3 jobs to put them through the finest boarding schools in England and Switzerland. I was a liability, a relic of a bygone era that didn't fit into their high-flying, Instagram-perfect lives in London and Milan. Julian was checking his Rolex every 30 seconds, his face tight with the irritation of someone who had better places to be. He was a venture architect, whatever that means, and he dressed the part tailored Italian wool, hair slicked back with enough product to weather a hurricane, and an air of superiority that he wore like a shield. Claire, on the other hand, was draped in layers of silk, her eyes constantly flitting to her phone, her fingers tapping out messages to people I'm sure she didn't even like. They looked around my home, my sanctuary, with a mixture of pity and disgust. They saw the faded wallpaper and the bookshelves sagging under the weight of leather-bound classics as signs of failure. They didn't see the memories etched into the wood of the dining table or the history contained in the old maps on the wall. To them, this was just underutilized real estate, a piece of the past that needed to be liquidated to fund their next strategic pivot. Look, Dad, Julian said, his voice dropping into that condescending tone people use for toddlers and the elderly. We've discussed this with the solicitors. Keeping this place up is, well, it's a drain. It's inefficient. You're rattling around here like a ghost in an old museum. There's a wonderful lifestyle community just outside of Brussels. It's modern, it's secure, and frankly, it's more your speed. We could sell this land. The developers are biting at the bit to put up some luxury villas, and that would more than cover the entrance fee. You'd be comfortable. You wouldn't have to worry about the roof or the heating anymore. He said it as if he were doing me a favor, as if stripping me of my autonomy and my history was an act of profound mercy. I looked at him, my hands steady on the arms of my chair, and I saw a stranger. I saw a man who knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. Claire chimed in, her voice a sharp contrast to the soft rain outside. And let's be honest, Father, your appearance isn't helping. That old tweed jacket, it's seen better decades. When we have our friends over to the estate in the summer, it's a bit difficult to explain. People ask if you're the gardener. It's embarrassing for Julian and me. We're trying to build something here, a reputation. And having you tucked away in this crumbling shack doesn't exactly scream success. We want the best for you, of course. But the best for you is also what's best for the family's image. Don't you want to see us thrive? Don't you want to be a part of our world? Even if it's from the sidelines of a very nice, very clean facility. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of a predator who had already tasted the kill. I didn't say a word. I just watched them. I thought back to the nights I spent in the 1970s, navigating the complex bureaucracies of the European steel trade, building a legacy from nothing but grit and a handshake. I thought of the favors I'd called in to get Julian his first internship at a top-tier firm, and the trust fund I'd quietly established for Claire when she decided she wanted to find herself in Paris for 3 years. They thought I was a simple man because I chose a simple life after Martha passed. They saw my old car, a reliable, well-maintained Volvo from the 90s, and saw poverty. They saw my hand-knitted sweaters and saw senility. They had no idea that the old man they were trying to put out to pasture was the very reason they had pastures to begin with. The irony was almost poetic, a bitter sort of comedy that only someone who has lived through 7 decades can truly appreciate. "You've already talked to developers?" I asked quietly. My voice was raspy, a side effect of the damp air, but it was firm. I saw Julian's eyes light up. He thought he'd won. He thought the old dog was finally rolling over. "Of course," he said, pulling a tablet from his briefcase. "I've got the preliminary contracts right here. It's a very generous offer. Dad, more than this pile of bricks is worth. Believe me. We've even picked out the room for you at the Laurels. It's got a view of the garden. You love gardens." "Right." He laughed, a hollow sound that echoed uncomfortably in the room. He didn't wait for my answer. He began scrolling through digital renderings of white-walled rooms and communal dining areas, treating my life as if it were a project to be managed and filed away. The disrespect was palpable, a heavy weight in the room that seemed to dim the lights. It wasn't just about the house. It was the total lack of recognition of my humanity. They spoke about me as if I weren't in the room, as if I were a piece of furniture that had become an eyesore. I saw Claire check her reflection in the mirror over the mantel, the one Martha and I had bought on our honeymoon in Venice. She adjusted her hair, completely oblivious to the fact that she was standing on the very ground where she'd taken her first steps. Ground she was now eager to sell to the highest bidder. It was a betrayal of the most fundamental kind. A rejection of heritage in favor of the immediate, the shiny, and the shallow. I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years, a cold, sharp anger that burned with the intensity of a blue flame. I stood up slowly, feeling the ache in my knees. A reminder of a life well lived. "I think," I said, "that you've said enough for one afternoon. I need some time to process this." Julian Seahill, a dramatic sound of feigned patience. "Dad, we don't have all day. The market is moving, and these developers won't wait forever. Just sign the intent to sell, and we can get the ball rolling. It's for your own good, truly." He held out a digital pen, his hand hovering over the tablet like a beckoning claw. I looked at the pen, then at my son, and then at the daughter, who couldn't even look me in the eye for more than a second. I realized then that they didn't just want the money. They wanted to erase the reminder of where they came from. They wanted to be self-made gods, untethered from the common roots of a father who still repaired his own fences. I said, "I need time," I repeated, my voice dropping an octave. There was a shift in the air, a momentary flicker of doubt in Julian's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by his usual arrogance. "Fine," he snapped, snapping the tablet shut. "We're heading into the city for the evening. There's a charity gala at the Grand Hotel, very exclusive, very high profile. We'll stop by tomorrow morning on our way to the airport. Have the papers ready. Dad, don't be difficult. You're 75, not 17. It's time to stop playing at being independent and let us take care of things." They walked out without a hug, without a backward glance, leaving the door slightly ajar so the cold air could whistle through the hallway. I stood there in the silence, the ticking of the grandfather clock, the only sound in the house, and I felt a strange sense of clarity. I walked over to the old roll-top desk in the corner of the room, the one I kept locked with a heavy brass key. I turned the key, the mechanism smooth and well-oiled, and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger and a sleek, black satellite phone that looked out of place among the inkwells and stationery. My fingers hovered over the buttons. For 20 years, I had lived as Arthur the retiree, the quiet widower who enjoyed his tea and his books. I had purposefully stepped away from the world of international finance and industrial power, wanting a peace that the boardroom could never provide. I had given my children everything they asked for, hoping that generosity would breed character. I was wrong. I had raised children who mistook kindness for weakness and modesty for failure. I dialed a number that wasn't in any public directory, a number that connected directly to a private office in Zurich. The phone rang once. Liechtenstein. A voice answered, professional and sharp. "It's Arthur," I said, and I heard the person on the other end catch their breath. "Sir, it's been a very long time." I looked out the window at the departing taillights of Julian's expensive SUV, disappearing into the mist. "Yes, it has," I replied, my voice now carrying the weight of the man I used to be, the man I still was. "I need a full audit of the Vane Sterling conglomerate. Every subsidiary, every debt, every board seat, and I want a seat at the Grand Hotel Gala tonight, the main table. And tell the concierge, I'll be arriving in my own time." As I hung up, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. They wanted a strategic pivot. I would give them one. They thought I was a ghost in a museum. Perhaps it was time the ghost showed them who actually owned the museum. I went to my wardrobe and pulled out a suit that hadn't seen the light of day in a decade, a charcoal gray masterpiece of Savile Row tailoring. Hidden behind my old tweed jackets, It still fit perfectly. I looked at myself in the mirror, the silver hair, the lined face, and I didn't see an old man. I saw a veteran. I saw a builder. I saw a man who was about to remind his children that before you can tear down a house, you have to make sure the owner isn't still inside, holding the keys to everything you think you own. The game was beginning, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to play. The drive to the city was long, giving me plenty of time to reflect on the decades of giving. I remembered the times I had bailed Julian out of his failed tech startups without a word of judgment, and the way I had quietly settled Claire's astronomical credit card bills when she was trying to impress the jet-set crowd in Marbella. I had done it out of love, out of a desire to see them happy. But in doing so, I had stunted them. I had allowed them to believe that the world owed them a living, and that I was merely a fountain of resources to be tapped until dry. They didn't see the sacrifice. They only saw the supply. And now, they were trying to shut off the source while taking the fountain for themselves. It was a classic European tragedy, played out in the modern age. But I was determined to write a different ending. As I approached the Grand Hotel, the rain had turned into a steady downpour, reflecting the neon lights of the city and the slick pavement. The hotel was a bastion of old-world elegance, a place where the elite gathered to preen and posture. I parked my old Volvo a block away, not out of shame, but because I wanted to walk. I wanted to feel the rain on my face, to ground myself before entering the lion's den. I adjusted my coat, my old, worn tweed coat over my expensive suit, and walked toward the gilded entrance. I looked like a man who had lost his way, an interloper in a world of silk and gold. And as I reached the heavy glass doors, I saw the doorman's eyes narrow, his posture stiffening as he prepared to turn away a man who clearly didn't belong. I smiled to myself. He had no idea that tonight, the world was going to change. The rain lashed against the heavy mahogany doors of the Grand Hotel, a sound like 1,000 whispers, trying to warn the people inside that the world was about to shift. I stood there for a moment, the dampness of my old tweed coat seeping into my shoulders, looking every bit the wandering pensioner who had taken a wrong turn on his way to the library. The doorman, a man in a uniform so stiff it looked like armor, stepped forward, his umbrella held like a weapon. He didn't see the man who had once signed the trade agreements that kept this city's lights burning. He saw an obstacle. He saw a nuisance. "I'm sorry, he said, his voice dripping with that polished, artificial politeness that is unique to the grandest institutions of Europe. "This is a private event. The shelter is 3 blocks down, past the station. You can't loiter here in the rain." I looked him in the eye, not with anger, but with a quiet, unsettling patience. I didn't reach for a badge or a fancy invitation. I simply stood my ground, the water dripping from the brim of my hat onto the pristine marble of the entryway. "I am not loitering," I said softly, my voice carrying a resonance that made him blink. "I am attending." The doorman let out a short, sharp huff of a laugh, a sound of pure derision. "Attending? Sir, this is the European Industrialist Gala. The ticket price alone would buy that coat of yours 100 times over. Please, move along before I have to call security. We have actual guests arriving." He gestured toward a sleek black limousine pulling up to the curb, a vehicle that likely cost more than the average person earns in a lifetime. At that moment, the doors of the limo opened, and out stepped Julian and Claire. They looked like royalty, or at least the modern, hollow version of it. Julian was adjusting his cuffs, his face set in a mask of practiced importance, while Claire checked her reflection in the darkened window of the car. They didn't notice me at first. They were too busy projecting an image of success to notice the reality of their own father standing 5 feet away. When they finally did see me, the transformation in their faces was a study in horror. It wasn't the horror of seeing a loved one in distress. It was the horror of a socialite seeing a cockroach on a wedding cake. Their reputation, their carefully constructed world of appearances, was being threatened by the presence of a man in a wet tweed jacket. "Father," Julian hissed, lunging forward to grab my arm and pull me toward the shadows of the stone pillars. "What on earth are you doing here? I told you we were coming here for work. This is a high-level networking event, not a family outing. Look at you. You're soaked. You're a mess. People are staring." He looked around frantically, terrified that someone of importance might witness this domestic catastrophe. Claire followed, her heels clicking sharply against the wet stone. "This is too much. Even for you," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and embarrassment. "Are you trying to ruin us? Do you have any idea who is inside that room? The CEOs of half the energy sector are in there. If they think we're associated with this, our deals will fall through before the first course is served." I remained calm, a stark contrast to their frantic energy. "I simply thought it was time I saw the world you're so eager to build," I said, my voice steady. "You speak so often of strategy and legacy. I wanted to see what those words look like in practice. Julian's grip on my arm tightened. This isn't a game. Dad, we are trying to save the family name. We are trying to secure a future that you've clearly given up on. Now, please, for the love of God, go back to the car. I'll call a taxi for you. Just get out of sight before the chairman of the Vane Sterling Group arrives. He's the most powerful man in the room, and he doesn't tolerate distractions. He started reaching for his phone, his fingers shaking as he tried to navigate his contacts, his eyes never leaving the hotel entrance, scanning for any sign of his peers. It was a fascinating thing to witness the utter conviction of the young that they are the only ones who understand the mechanics of power. They treated me like a senile child, a burden to be managed and hidden away, completely oblivious to the fact that I had walked these halls when they were still in nursery school. The doorman, seeing the important young man's reaction to me, grew even bolder. Sir, the doorman said to Julian, is this man bothering you? I can have him removed immediately. Julian hesitated, the weight of his own shame visible in his eyes. No. Julian stammered. He's a distant relative. He's confused. We're taking care of it. The word relative stung more than any insult. Not father. Not the man who raised him. Just a confused relative? A biological footnote to be edited out of the story? I stepped back, allowing them to usher me away from the main entrance and toward the side service door. Fine, I said, a small smile playing on my lips. I wouldn't want to be a distraction. I'll find my own way. Claire sighed with relief, a sound that cut deeper than she could imagine. Thank you, Father. Truly, we'll talk in the morning about the house. Just go home and rest. This world, it's just not for you anymore. They turned and walked back toward the grand entrance, their shoulders squaring, their heads held high, as they prepared to enter the lion's den, never realizing that the lion was the one they had just kicked toward the servants' entrance. They entered the warmth and light of the gala, leaving me in the rain, a forgotten shadow in the landscape of their ambition. But I didn't go home. I walked around the side of the building, my footsteps echoing in the narrow alleyway. I reached the service entrance, where a young man in a waiter's jacket was taking a quick break, his breath visible in the cold air. He looked at me, his eyes tired but kind. Rough night, Pops, he asked, offering a small nod. The rain's a beast. I smiled at him, a genuine smile this time. It is indeed, I replied. I reached into the inner pocket of my tweed coat, past the wet fabric, and pulled out a small, gold-embossed card. I believe this allows me access to the kitchen entrance. I'd prefer to avoid the spectacle at the front. The waiter took the card, his eyes widening as he read the name and the security clearance printed on the back. His posture changed instantly. My apologies. Monsieur, I didn't realize. The manager is inside. He's been expecting he's been expecting someone very important. I'm just an old man looking for a warm room, I said, patting him on the shoulder as I stepped inside. The warmth of the hotel hit me like a physical wave, the smell of roasting meats, expensive perfume, and the faint, metallic scent of old money. I walked through the bustling kitchen, the staff moving with a frantic, choreographed precision. They ignored me, assuming I was a contractor or perhaps a late delivery man. I made my way toward the back elevators, the private ones reserved for the hotel's owners and their most esteemed guests. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the penthouse ballroom level. As the elevator ascended, I felt the years falling away. The ache in my knees was still there, but it was overshadowed by a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in decades. I was no longer just Arthur the widower. I was Arthur the architect. When the elevator doors opened, I was at the very back of the ballroom, shielded by a forest of decorative palms and silk drapes. The room was a sea of black ties and evening gowns, a glittering display of European wealth. At the center of it all, I could see Julian and Claire. They were standing near a group of men in sharp suits, laughing a little too loudly at a joke that clearly wasn't that funny. They were trying so hard to belong, to be seen as equals by men who viewed them as nothing more than ambitious middle management. I watched as Julian tried to approach a tall, silver-haired man standing near the podium, the legendary Marcus Vane, the head of the conglomerate my children so desperately wanted to impress. Marcus didn't even look at Julian. He merely handed his empty glass to my son as if Julian were a waiter. Before turning back to his conversation, the humiliation was subtle. But for someone who knows the language of power, it was deafening. My son, the venture architect, was being treated like a servant by the very man he idolized, and Claire was no better, hovering on the outskirts of a conversation about offshore wind farms, nodding enthusiastically at terms she barely understood, her eyes searching for any crumb of validation. It was heartbreaking and infuriating all at once. I had raised them to be leaders, but they had chosen to be sycophants. They had abandoned the values of hard work and integrity for the hollow promise of proximity to wealth. They were willing to sell their father's legacy for a seat at a table that didn't even have a place setting for them. I slowly began to move through the crowd. I didn't head for Julian or Claire. Instead, I moved toward the bar, where an old friend was standing. A man named Henri, who had been the head of European banking for more years than I cared to count. He was nursing a glass of mineral water, looking bored by the surrounding opulence. As I approached, he didn't look up at first. "The service is slow tonight," he muttered to no one in particular. "I've been waiting 10 minutes for a lime." I stood beside him, my wet tweed coat brushing against his silk sleeve. "Maybe it's because you're looking for the lime in the wrong places." "Henri," I said softly. "Henri froze." He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the old man in the wet coat. Then, a look of pure, unadulterated shock washed over his face. "Arthur," he whispered, his voice cracking. Is that really you? My God. Man. Word on the street was that you'd retired to a monastery in the Alps, or vanished into the mist. You look like a fisherman who got lost on his way to the docks." He let out a booming laugh, drawing the attention of several nearby guests. "I prefer to think of it as a tactical disguise," I replied, shaking his hand. The strength of my grip seemed to reassure him that I wasn't a ghost. "I've been watching the room. Henri, it seems the new generation has forgotten how to build things. They're too busy trying to look like they've already built them." Henri nodded, his expression turning serious. "It's a disaster. Arthur, greed without vision, especially that Vain Sterling crowd. They're trying to hostile take over everything in sight, including some local assets that should stay in the community. They have no respect for heritage." "I know," I said, my eyes tracking Julian as he hovered near Marcus Vane again. "I've noticed." Henri looked at me, a shrewd glint in his eye. "Why are you here?" "Arthur, you didn't come all this way just to tell me I'm looking for limes in the wrong places. You've been quiet for 20 years. Why break the silence now?" I took a deep breath, the scent of the ballroom suddenly feeling stifling. "Because," I said, "the wolves have entered my garden, Henri, and they've forgotten who planted the trees." I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear. "I need you to do me a favor. That auction tonight, the one for the historic manor and the surrounding industrial rights. I want to know the current height, and I want to know exactly which strategic partners are backing Marcus Vane." Henri smiled, a slow, predatory grin that reminded me why he was the most feared banker in the EU. "I can do better than that. Arthur, I can give you the keys to the vault. But tell me, are you planning to join the party, or are you planning to end it?" I looked across the room at my children, who were currently laughing at another joke from a man who clearly despised them. I felt a pang of sadness, followed by a surge of cold. Hard resolve. They wanted a world without me. They wanted a future where the past was just an inconvenience to be sold. Fine. I would give them the world they asked for, but I would make sure they knew exactly who paid for the ticket. "I'm not here to end the party. Henri," I said, my voice as cold as the rain outside. "I'm here to remind them that the bill is due, and I'm the one who signs the checks." The tension in the room was palpable now, at least to those who knew what to look for. The gala was shifting toward its main event, the grand auction of the Blackwood estate, a massive tract of land and heritage that had been the cornerstone of the region for centuries. It was the very land Julian and Claire were obsessed with, the land they thought they were helping me sell. But they didn't realize that the Blackwood estate wasn't just a house. It was the heart of a dozen different industries, a hub of European history that I had spent my life protecting. As the auctioneer took the stage, the room fell silent. This wasn't just about money. It was about dominance. And in the back of the room, hidden behind the silk and the palms, the old man in the tweed coat began to move, a silent predator in a room full of brightly colored birds. I saw Julian lean into Claire's ear, his face flushed with excitement. "This is it," I could hear him say from across the distance, his voice carrying that tone of unearned victory. "Once Vane wins this, we're in. He's promised us a seat on the development board. We'll finally be part of the inner circle. No more living in the shadow of the old ways. We're going to transform this whole region into a modern hub." He looked so proud, so sure of himself, completely unaware that he was about to sell the ground he stood on to a man who would pave it over without a second thought. I felt a final flicker of hesitation, the father in me wanting to protect them from their own stupidity. But that flicker was quickly extinguished. Some lessons can only be learned through fire, and tonight, the fire was going to be very, very hot. As the bidding began, the numbers climbed with dizzying speed. Million after million. The wealth of Europe was being tossed around like chips at a casino table. Marcus Vane sat at the front, his posture relaxed, his hand raised with the casual arrogance of a man who knows he cannot lose. Julian and Claire were standing behind him, practically vibrating with reflected glory. They were so close to the power they craved. They were so close to the future they had sacrificed their father for. The auctioneer's hammer hovered in the air, the room holding its collective breath. Going once, going twice. The auctioneer called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. The room was silent. Vane had won. Julian and Claire were already starting to clap, their faces split by triumphant grins. They had done it. They had erased the past. But then, a voice came from the back of the room, not loud, not a shout, but a voice that cut through the silence like a blade. 10 million more. And I'll take the industrial rights as a separate line item. Effective immediately. The room spun. Necks craned. Heads turned. Julian and Claire froze, their hands still in mid-clap, their eyes searching the shadows at the back of the ballroom. And there, stepping out from behind the silk drapes, was the man they had kicked out into the rain. I had removed the wet tweed coat, revealing the charcoal gray suit beneath a suit that radiated more authority than every tuxedo in the room combined. I walked slowly toward the front, the crowd parting from me like the Red Sea. I didn't look at the auctioneer. I didn't look at Marcus Vane. I looked directly at my children. The shock on their faces was a masterpiece of disbelief. Julian's mouth hung open, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Claire looked as if she were about to faint, her hand flying to her throat, as she recognized the man she had called a distraction only an hour ago. The room was buzzing with whispers. Who is that? Is that Arthur Vane Sterling? I thought he was dead. The auctioneer was frozen, his hammer still in the air. Marcus Vane turned in his seat, his eyes narrowing as he took in my appearance. He recognized me, of course he did. He had been my apprentice 30 years ago, before his ambition turned into something darker. Arthur, he spat, his voice a mixture of fear and fury. What is the meaning of this? This is a closed auction. You have no standing here. I stopped at the edge of the stage, my hands clasped behind my back. I looked at the man who had tried to buy my history. I have more standing than you realize. Marcus, I said, my voice echoing through the speakers. You see, I didn't just build the Blackwood estate. I built the trust that manages the very bank you're using to fund this bid. And I believe the terms of your credit line were, shall we say, revised approximately 20 minutes ago. I turned to the auctioneer and nodded. The bid stands. And I believe I have the right of first refusal on all legacy assets in this province. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the smell of a crumbling empire. Julian and Claire were staring at me as if they were seeing a ghost. And in a way, they were. They were seeing the ghost of the man they had tried to bury. And he was holding the keys to their entire world. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted from celebration to a cold, clinical execution of justice. The elite of Europe watched in stunned silence as the old man they had ignored all evening systematically dismantled the plans of the most powerful man in the room. I could feel the heat of the spotlights on my face, a stark contrast to the cold rain I had been standing in just an hour prior. My children were still standing there, paralyzed, caught between the world they had tried to join and the father they had tried to discard. The realization was slowly dawning on them. They hadn't been managing a liability. They had been insulting the architect of their own existence. And now, the architect was reclaiming his blueprints. The silence that followed my declaration was not merely a lack of sound. It was a physical weight, a heavy velvet curtain that had fallen over the entire ballroom. In the grand traditions of our continent, we are taught that true power does not need to shout. And in that moment, my whisper had echoed louder than any auctioneer's gavel. I stood at the foot of the stage, the light from the crystal chandeliers catching the silver in my hair. And for the first time in 20 years, I felt the full stature of my own history. I looked at Marcus Vane, who was clutching the arms of his front row chair so tightly his knuckles were as white as the linens on the tables. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. And perhaps he had the ghost of the man who had taught him everything he knew about the steel and soul of European industry. Julian and Claire were frozen behind him, looking like statues of marble cold, pale, and utterly motionless. The arrogance that had fueled their walk into this hotel had evaporated, replaced by a raw, naked terror. They didn't step forward to embrace me. They didn't cry out in relief. They simply stared, their minds clearly racing to tally the number of insults they had hurled at me in the last 12 hours. Father, Julian finally managed to choke out, the words sounding brittle and foreign in his mouth. He looked down at the auction catalog in his hand, then back at me, his eyes darting to the powerful men in the room, who were now bowing their heads in my direction. The realization was hitting him like a physical blow. The confused relative he had tried to hide in the service corridor was the man whose signature appeared on the very foundation of his career. I didn't acknowledge Julian yet. My focus was on Marcus. You've grown careless. Marcus, I said, my voice carrying effortlessly to the back of the hall. You thought that because I chose the quiet of the countryside, and the company of my books. I had lost the ability to read a balance sheet. You saw a tired old man in a tweed coat and assumed the mind behind it had softened. But in this part of the world, we know that the oldest vines produce the strongest wine. Marcus tried to stand, his face contorting into a mask of indignant rage. This is an ambush. Arthur, you can't just revoke a credit line in the middle of a public tender. There are laws. There are protocols. I smiled. A small, weary smile that didn't reach my eyes. The protocol, Marcus, is that one does not borrow money from a man while simultaneously plotting to dismantle his legacy. The Sterling Trust, which I founded before you were old enough to shave, has a moral clause. I suggest you read the fine print of your financing agreement. We do not fund predators who seek to pave over history for the sake of a quarterly dividend. The room erupted into a low murmur, a swarm of whispers that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor. The vain sterling conglomerate, the pride of the European markets, was suddenly being torn apart at the seams by the man who put the sterling in the name. I could see the other industrialists in the room, men I had dined with in Paris, London, and Berlin decades ago, exchanging knowing looks. They remembered the man who had negotiated the treaties that stabilized the post-war markets. They remembered the man who had valued the worker in the factory as much as the executive in the penthouse. They had watched the company slide into greed under Marcus's leadership, and now they were witnessing the correction. It was a moment of profound European justice, the kind that isn't found in a courtroom, but in the restoration of honor. Claire finally found her voice. Though it was high and frantic, she rushed toward me, her silk dress rustling like a warning. Dad. Oh my God. Dad. We were so worried. We didn't know you were. I mean, we thought you were struggling. Why didn't you tell us? We were only trying to help you with the house because we thought you couldn't afford the upkeep. The lie was so transparent, so desperate, that it made my heart ache for her. She reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back. Not out of malice, but out of a need for clarity. You weren't worried about my comfort, Claire, I said quietly, so only she and Julian could hear. You were worried about your image. You saw my life as a blemish on your carefully curated existence. You didn't see a father. You saw a liability to be liquidated. Julian stepped up beside her, his face a fluctuating shade of red and gray. Look, let's not do this here. Father, this is a private family matter. We can go back to the hotel. Talk this through. I'm sure there's been a massive misunderstanding. If we had known you were still involved with the trust, we would have consulted you on every move. We're a team. Right. The Vane Sterling family. He tried to put on that winning smile, the one he used to secure venture capital from unsuspecting investors. But it was hollow. He was still trying to manage the situation, still trying to find a way to pivot this disaster into a win. He hadn't learned a thing. He was still looking for the angle, even when the man he was trying to con was the one who had taught him how to walk. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and I felt a profound sense of failure, not his, but mine. I had given them too much and asked for too little. I had shielded them from the harsh realities of the world for so long that they had forgotten that wealth is a responsibility, not a right. The only misunderstanding, Julian, was mine. I said, my voice hardening. I misunderstood the quality of the people I was leaving my world to. I thought that by giving you every advantage, you would develop a sense of stewardship. Instead, you developed a sense of entitlement. You stand here in a suit that costs more than a year's pension for the men who built this company. And you have the audacity to speak to me about teamwork while you were preparing to sell my home out from under me. The auctioneer, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, cleared his throat. Mr. Sterling, the bid for the Blackwood estate. You offered $10 million over the previous high, plus the industrial rights. Is that correct? I turned my back on my children and looked at the stage. That is correct, I said firmly. And as the primary holder of the Regional Heritage Bond, I am exercising my right to take the property into a non-profit trust. It will not be developed. It will be restored as a public park and a museum of European industrial history. The jobs associated with the estate will be protected under a lifetime guarantee. A smattering of applause started in the back of the room, likely from the hotel staff and the few old guard members who still cared about the community, and it grew into a steady, rhythmic thrum. Ep. Marcus Vane was livid. He stood up, his face purple. You're destroying the company. Arthur, without that development, the stock will crater. You're wiping out billions in value, just to save a few old trees and a crumbling manor. You're a dinosaur. This isn't how the modern world works. I looked at him with a pity that seemed to infuriate him even more. The modern world works on credit, Marcus. And as of tonight, yours has expired. I am not destroying the company. I am pruning it. I am removing the rot so that the roots can breathe again. If the stock craters because we chose people over pixels, then let it crater. I have enough to buy the remains and start again. The right way. I turned back to Julian and Claire. They looked smaller now, as if the air was being sucked out of their lungs. They were realizing that the seat on the board Marcus had promised them was gone. The luxury villas they were going to sell were never going to be built. The life of easy influence they had envisioned was evaporating like mist in the morning sun. You told me earlier today that it was time for me to stop playing at being independent. I reminded them. You told me to let you take care of things. Well, I've decided to take your advice. I'm taking care of everything. From this moment on, your access to the Sterling family accounts is suspended. If you want to build a legacy, you will do it the way I did with your own hands, your own sweat, and your own integrity. Claire gasped, her eyes filling with tears that I hoped, for her sake, were genuine. You're cutting us off. But Father, our lives, our commitments, we have reputations to uphold. I looked at her, my heart heavy but my mind clear. A reputation built on someone else's shadow is not a reputation. Claire, it's a delusion. You are both young. You are healthy. You are educated. Use those gifts. Find out who you are when you aren't the children of the Sterling Trust. Maybe then, you'll find the humanity you seem to have misplaced along the way. I saw Julian's fists clench, the rage of a spoiled child boiling beneath the surface. But he didn't dare speak. He knew that one more word could cost him even the meager allowance I might eventually see fit to grant him if he showed signs of change. I walked toward the exit, my steps light and purposeful. The doorman who had tried to turn me away earlier was standing by the door, his face a mask of abject apology. He bowed so low I thought he might hit the floor. Mr. Sterling, I had no idea. Please, allow me to get your car. I stopped and looked at him. The Volvo is fine where it is. I said, I think I'll walk a bit further. The rain has stopped, and the air is finally clear. I stepped out into the night, the cool breeze of the European evening greeting me like an old friend. Behind me, the gala continued, but the music sounded different, less like a celebration, and more like an ending. As I walked down the damp streets, the lights of the city reflecting in the puddles, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had lost the family I thought I had, but I had regained the man I knew I was. I thought of Martha, and I knew she would have been proud not of the money, but of the stand. We had always believed that the measure of a person was how they treated those who could do nothing for them. My children had failed that test, and tonight, I had been the one to grade the papers. It was a harsh lesson, a bitter draft of reality, but it was the only way to save them from becoming the very things they admired. Hollow shells of people, decorated in silk and gold. I reached the bridge overlooking the river, the water flowing dark and deep beneath the ancient stone arches. I looked out over the city, a tapestry of history and hope, and I realized that my work wasn't finished. I had reclaimed the estate, but now I had to build something new. I had to show the next generation that you can be successful without being cruel, and powerful without being heartless. I pulled the old satellite phone from my pocket and dialed Henri. Arthur, the banker answered, his voice full of excitement. That was magnificent. The markets are already reacting. Vane is finished. What's the next move? I watched a lone swan glide across the dark water, silent and graceful. The next move, Henri, I said, is to go home. I have a garden to tend to, and this time, I'm planting something that will last a lot longer than a skyscraper. The night was quiet now, the city's frantic energy settling into a respectful hum. I felt the weight of my 75 years, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a foundation. I had been invisible, ignored, and insulted. But in the end, it was the old man who had the final word. And as I walked back toward my car, I knew that tomorrow would be a very different kind of day. The vultures had been scattered. The garden had been reclaimed. And the script had been flipped. My life was my own again. And the legacy of the Sterling name was finally back in the hands of the man who knew what it was truly worth. I thought about the young waiter who had let me in through the kitchen. He had seen me as a human being before he knew I was a billionaire. I made a mental note to ensure he received a scholarship for whatever he wanted to study. That was the kind of world I wanted to live in, a world where a wet tweed coat doesn't disqualify you from kindness. As I started the engine of my old Volvo, the familiar rumble felt like a reassuring heartbeat. I drove away from the Grand Hotel, leaving the glitter and the greed behind, heading back toward the cottage, where the air was honest and the memories were real. The invisible man was going home, and he was taking his dignity with him. The road ahead was dark, but my headlights were strong. Cutting through the lingering mist, I knew the journey with Julian and Claire wasn't over. There would be more tears, more anger, and perhaps, eventually, a true reconciliation. But that would happen on my terms. In my world, where values weren't for sale, I had shown them the power of the past. And now it was up to them to decide if they wanted a future in it. As the city skyline faded in the rearview mirror, I smiled. It was a good night to be an old man in Europe. It was a good night to be alive. The dawn that broke over the countryside the next morning was unlike any I had seen in years. It was crisp, golden, and carried the scent of damp earth and pine. A true European spring morning that seemed to wash away the stale, suffocating air of the ballroom. I sat on my porch, a simple wooden chair that had supported me through many a sunrise, holding a chipped ceramic mug filled with strong, black coffee. My expensive suit was tucked away, replaced by my reliable corduroy trousers and that same old tweed jacket that had caused my children so much embarrassment. But as I looked out over the rolling hills, I didn't feel like a man who had just dismantled a multi-billion-euro empire. I felt like a man who had finally finished weeding his garden. The news had traveled faster than a summer storm. By the time I had finished my first cup of coffee, the headlines across London, Paris, and Frankfurt were screaming about the resurrection of the silent giant. The vain sterling stock had indeed plummeted, just as Marcus had predicted. But it wasn't the disaster he had feared. It was a correction. Investors who had grown weary of Marcus's cutthroat tactics were suddenly invigorated by the return of a man who valued long-term stability over short-term greed. My phone, the one I had kept silent for 2 decades, was buzzing with messages from old colleagues, heads of state, legendary bankers, and humble craftsmen I had once helped, all offering their support. But I ignored them for the moment. There was one more piece of business I had to attend to, and it didn't involve a boardroom. Around noon, the familiar sound of a high-performance engine echoed through the valley. A sleek, silver SUV, the one Julian used to flaunt his status, crawled up the gravel path and came to a halt in front of my cottage. The doors opened, but the people who stepped out were not the same arrogant figures who had paced my floorboards 24 hours earlier. Julian's hair was disheveled, his expensive Italian suit wrinkled as if he had slept in it, which, knowing the state of the markets, he likely had. Claire followed, her eyes red and puffy behind designer sunglasses that she eventually took off, revealing a look of pure, unadulterated defeat. They stood by the car for a long moment, looking at the small cottage they had called a shack. And for the first time, they seemed to see the dignity in its weathered walls. They approached the porch slowly, their footsteps heavy on the wooden stairs. There was no shouting this time. No condescending talk of strategic pivots or lifestyle communities. Julian stopped at the top step, his hands trembling slightly as he shoved them into his pockets. "It's gone, Dad," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Everything. Marcus has been ousted. The board has frozen my options. And the firm. They told me my services are no longer required. Apparently, nobody wants to hire the man who tried to put Arthur Sterling in a nursing home." He looked at me, and I saw the boy. He used to be the one who used to look at me with wonder, before he learned to look at me with a price tag. Claire sat on the edge of the porch, her silk skirt trailing in the dust. And she didn't even seem to care. "My friends? They won't even take my calls." "Father," she said, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I was supposed to host the gallery opening next week, and they've already replaced me. I realized this morning that I don't actually own anything. Not the apartment, not the car, not even the respect I thought I had. It was all just a loan from you that I forgot to pay back." She looked out at the hills, her expression hollow. "We came here to ask. Well, we don't even know what to ask for anymore. We have nothing left." I set my coffee mug down and looked at them both. This was the moment I had prepared for. The moment most people would use for a final, crushing blow of, "I told you so." But that is not the European way. And it certainly isn't the way of a father who still carries the memory of his children's first steps. "You are wrong," I said quietly. "You don't have nothing. You have exactly what I had when I started. Your health, your education, and the Sterling name, though. You'll have to work quite hard to make that name mean something honorable again. You lost the illusions. Yes, but you haven't lost your lives." Julian looked up, a spark of hope or perhaps just desperation in his eyes. "So, you're going to help us. You're going to reinstate our accounts." I shook my head slowly, and the spark died. "No, Julian, if I give you back the money now, I am only buying your silence, not your character. I am not going to let you starve, but I am not going to let you stay comfortable in your arrogance. I have purchased a small, struggling vineyard in the south part of the Blackwood acquisition. It needs a manager who isn't afraid to get his hands dirty, and it needs someone to handle the logistics who understands that a business is only as good as the people who work the soil. You will both go there. You will live in the workers' quarters. You will learn how to make something with your hands that people actually value." Claire looked horrified. "Work in a vineyard? Dad, we don't know anything about farming." I stood up, the old tweed jacket, feeling like a suit of armor. "Then you will learn. You will learn that a legacy isn't something you inherit, it's something you grow. You will receive a wage, the same wage as the other workers. If, after a year, you have shown that you can be part of a community instead of just its masters, then we will talk about your future. But for now, the venture architect and the socialite are retired. It's time for Julian and Claire Sterling to find out if they are actually worth anything without a credit card to prove it. The silence that followed was long and heavy. I watched the realization sink in that the sweet revenge they might have expected was actually a far more difficult path. The path of humility. Julian looked at his hands, then at the hills. And finally, he nodded. It wasn't an enthusiastic nod, but it was a beginning. "Okay," he said, his voice cracking. "Okay, Dad. We'll go." Claire didn't say anything, but she reached out and took my hand, a brief, tentative squeeze that felt more real than any hug she'd given me in a decade. They turned and walked back to the SUV, leaving the echoes of their old lives behind them on my gravel driveway. As they drove away, I felt a profound sense of closure. I had not only saved my home and my heritage, but I had given my children the only gift that truly mattered, a chance to be better than they were. I went inside the cottage and walked to the old roll-top desk. I picked up the photograph of Martha that sat next to my inkwell. She was smiling, her eyes full of that quiet, French grace that had always grounded me. "I think they're going to be all right, Martha," I whispered to the empty room. It took a bit of a storm to clear the air, but the roots are still there. A week later, I stood at the gates of the Blackwood estate. A large crowd had gathered, local families, former employees of Marcus Vane, and curious onlookers from the city. I wasn't there as a billionaire. I was there as the chairman of the Legacy Trust. I didn't give a long, boastful speech about my triumph. Instead, I simply took a pair of old iron shears and cut the velvet ribbon that had barred the entrance for so long. "This land belongs to the history of this province," I told the crowd. "It is a place for the young to learn where they came from, and for the old to see that their work is remembered. Welcome home." As the gates swung open and the children ran toward the gardens, I felt a warmth in my chest that no amount of money could ever provide. The story of the Sterling family became a bit of a legend in our corner of Europe, a warning to the Herm Hin, the snobs, and a beacon of hope for those who feel invisible. Marcus Vane disappeared into the shadows of legal battles and forgotten boardrooms. A man who learned too late that you cannot build a kingdom on a foundation of contempt. And as for me, I returned to my cottage. I still drive my old Volvo, and I still wear my tweed jackets. But now, when I walk through the village, people don't look at me with pity. They look at me with a quiet respect, knowing that beneath the surface of every ordinary person is a story of strength, a history of struggle, and perhaps a hidden power that only reveals itself when the time is right. To those of you listening to this, especially my friends who have reached the silver years of your lives, never let the world tell you that your value has expired. Your wrinkles are maps of where you've been. Your gray hair is the frost of 1,000 winters you've survived. And your silence is not a void, but a reservoir of wisdom. People will judge you by your clothes, your cars, and your age. Let them underestimate you. Because there is no greater satisfaction than the moment you step out of the shadows and remind the world that the old ways are the only ways that truly hold the world together. Be proud of your heritage, hold on to your integrity, and never, ever be afraid to flip the script when the vultures start circling. Life is not a race to the finish. It is a journey of stewardship. We are the guardians of the past and the architects of the future. And as long as we stand tall, the heart of Europe and the heart of humanity will never stop beating. Thank you for walking this path with me today. Remember, the best part of the story is often the chapter that everyone thought was the end,